Welcome all to this second installment of this lesson on this subject, on the righteousness of Christ. So I am just going to introduce what the subject is. Tonight, we will endeavor by God's grace to demonstrate that the loud cry of the third angel has already begun, and we have had it for a long time, and just maybe try to establish why we are not seeing perhaps what we expect of it. When did it start? And also how the third angel's message is the preaching of the righteousness of Christ in its fullness, which is the gospel of freedom. He said in the book of John, I think it's John chapter 8, verse 32, and you shall know truth, and the truth shall set you free. And he adds a couple of verses after and says, whoever the Son shall make free, the Son shall make free is free indeed. So again, it is the relationship between the perfect law of liberty and the righteousness of Christ, and how it is the message that we ought to be preaching now more than any other message. So I guess in a nutshell, that's what tonight is going to be about.
Thank you for coming and joining this Bible study and prayer session today. I'm going to just share my screen with you so that we can begin. Okay, so today the lesson, like what Talent has said, is going to be about the righteousness of Christ. We want to dig deep into the message of righteousness by faith. But this message is got so many this is a very, very deep message, and it's got so many facets as well to it. And just this does not even do justice to even just the introduction of it. But this is a lesson that we have been learning as a family, and we thought some of these studies that we are learning on righteousness by faith, we've been studying these messages for years now. We have not been able to share them. But we've just been marinating on these and studying, and God revealing more and more light and truth on these messages. And the more we study and read these messages, the more we feel impressed, not just to share, but we also realize how urgent it is for us to understand this message in its entirety and be able to live it. Our salvation depends on us understanding this. And like I said, because it has so many facets, we're going to touch a certain angle before we even go into the message of righteousness by faith. But we're going to deal with understanding the time in which we are living. And like what Talent said, are we now living in the time of the loud cry? Are we, and a lot of these messages, a lot of these terms, people do not understand what, for instance, what is the connection between righteousness by faith and the loud cry message? What is the connection between the loud cry message and the third angel's message? What is the connection between the third angel's message, righteousness by faith message, the sealing message, and the Sabbath message? In all of these terms, it can seem confusing, but you're speaking pretty much of the same thing. So as we study these messages, we will see and we will understand deeper and deeper the more we study the reasons why we need to be more alert and awake, the reason why we need to understand this message. But as we have started, for those of us who have come this far in the faith, we want to understand our duties. We want to understand the reason why we need to be now more awake to this time and to understand this message. But for us to be able to do that, we will need to understand a timeline of events, okay? So like I said, the aim of this lesson is just to demonstrate based on Bible prophecy, the history and the evidence from not just the spirit of prophecy, but also the pioneers that we are living in the sealing time, the third angel's message time, the loud cry of the fourth angel. So in order for us to do that, we will need to go back in time. And we want to start by going back to the book of Revelation, chapter 14, to the three angels' message. And in order for us to understand, are we living in the loud cry? For we all know that the loud cry of the three angels' messages are in three categories. Basically, we're talking of one message, but they are split into three. So we have the first angel's message, we have the second angel's message, we also have the fourth angel's message, which is the message in Revelation chapter 18. So that is very important for us to understand. So we want to, first of all, understand, in order for us to understand if we are already living in the time of the third angel's message, we will need to understand if the other messages, the historical timeline of the other messages, and if they still apply, and what happened under those under the proclamation of those messages historically. So hopefully tonight can be a discussion. If any of us have any questions or a contribution, please feel free to also put your questions in the chat and also to contribute as we go along.
I just wanted to put a disclaimer on the picture in the front and the first one. And that's probably a misrepresentation of the righteousness of Christ. But it's probably the best picture to illustrate it. Because if you noticed, the figure of it is, the figure of Christ is covering the sinner in a clean garment. But if you check, the garment inside is still pretty much dirty. And that's not how Christ deals with us. He cleans us first. Yes, he covers our sins, but he cleans us. And you can see the demonstration of that with the demoniac in Mark chapter 5:15, when Christ removed all these legion of demons, the man was clothed and in his right mind. The surprise there was he was normal, he was clean. And that's the righteousness of Christ is a work of cleansing inside and outside. So I just wanted to put the disclaimer that probably doesn't best illustrate the righteousness of Christ.
Yes. It's also good to know and understand that anything that we if we want to be saved, we will need to renounce all. So our righteousness cannot be enough. Our righteousness is only but filthy rags. Thank you for that. So, okay, so let's get started. So like I said, for those who have just been joining us, we're going to demonstrate using the historical timeline. Are we living in the time of the third angel's message? Are we living, has the loud cry message already begun? And like I said, in order for us to illustrate that, we will need to go back to the Bible. And also we're going to use the spirit of prophecy. We're going to use the Adventist pioneers to illustrate the point of where we are, for God to show us where we are and what has happened. Because if we do not understand, some people might not like the idea of going back in history or certain historical elements. Some people just generally don't like history. And that's okay, it's a preference, but the problem is in the whole entire Bible, the spirit of prophecy is all based on historical events being repeated and being relevant in our time and into the future. So we would need to understand where we are coming from. So we will not get lost unless if we forget where we are coming. So for us to understand where we are going and where we are presently, we need to understand where we have come from, and that will give us context, motivation, and renewed zeal for us to do even more and to awake and understand our duty, the duty that God has given us for our time. So let's get started. I would ask if you have any writing instruments, if you've got a notepad or somewhere where you can jot down some of these things. They're very useful because it might go pretty fast. And this, by all means, cannot be a comprehensive lesson that will cover everything. We might skip through quite a lot of quotes without going into too much detail, but I would love you to at least jot down some of the quotations where we're taking it from and go and do your own study. So at least let's use these studies as teasers to intrigue or to sort of like base some of our studies on, at least so that it can help us to go and research. Don't take anything that we say without actually going to read and understand it for yourself. You need to know and understand this truth for yourself. This is why we've got so many books within our organization. God has allowed a lot of writings, not just the Spirit of Prophecy, but from the pioneers, and especially the Bible. So let's read it, let's make use of it, let's jot down some of these things if you can. It might come in handy in a Bible study with someone, or it might come in handy at some point where you will also be studying. So God bless you as we do that. So can I ask somebody in the audience to read Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 for me? For us all, actually, chapter 14, verse 6 and verse 7. Have we got our Bibles? Anyone? I would love the interaction. It would be good. Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 and verse 7.
Sister Tender, do you want me to read?
Yes, please. Anybody can read. Thank you, sister. Yes.
Okay. And I saw another angel fly in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made heaven and earth, and the sea and the fountains of waters. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Right. So this is the first angel's message. And we want to understand, for those who know and who have already studied Bible prophecy, you will know what an angel represents. We see here that John, after seeing Christ and the 144,000 on Mount Zion, we see Christ also here. We're given a view of the three angels' messages. And firstly, we see angels. What does an angel represent? Does anyone know what an angel represents in Bible prophecy without us going too deep into this?
An angel, the word angel in the English comes from the Greek agelos or angelos. Angelos means messenger. And I think it is an equivalent of the word malak in the Hebrew. And it simply denotes a messenger of any sort, as a dictionary definition. But as used in the book of Revelation, is talking about a special message, and people and the messengers sending that message to the world. But yeah, it is a message. I don't know if anyone has got an addition.
Yes, an angel in Bible prophecy represents a messenger. Thank you. And it also represents in this context a movement with a movement of people that have been sent by God with a particular message for a particular time. So we are going to see that here we are dealing with a global movement that God has raised in the form of his messengers, in the form of his saints, who are going into the world at a particular time to preach a particular message. And what is this message? It is a message of judgment. It is
our message.
It is a message of announcing an impending judgment, a judgment that is coming, telling people to not in whisper tones, but in a loud voice that also shows us and gives us an idea of how the impact of this message at that particular time. And it's telling people to fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth, pointing people back to the Creator, back to the 10 Commandments. And we see that it is also helping us to understand that there is no other one to be worshipped apart from the God who created these things. Not only are we supposed to do that, but we're supposed to fear him and worship him. So now let's go deeper. I want us to go to the book of Matthew chapter 24, for instance. So we just keep this thought in mind while we digress a little bit. We're going to go into the book of Matthew chapter 24. Jesus went on the Mount of Olives. We all know this chapter. The disciples come to him just after they got out of the temple, and they're showing him the beautiful temple, the stones, the precious ornaments of it. And they come and they ask Jesus, and they show Jesus the temple, and Jesus says, not one stone will be left upon another. And he talks about he gives them a curious statement that intrigues them to want to know more about what Christ was talking about. And in that, Jesus also, after they had asked Jesus, what is the sign, what is going to be the sign of your coming and of the end of time, the end of days, Jesus responds by giving signs that will take place in our world from his time going forward, all the way to his coming. And these signs, we all know, he talks about deception, he talks about the calamities that will take place. And amongst the many things that he talks about, he also talks about the Great Tribulation. So the Great Tribulation is a time Jesus was referring to let's read it from verse 21. So we're going to read verse 21 and 22, and then we're going to read from verse 29, I think. So let's start. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be, except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. Let's jump over to verse 29. It says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. And then verse 30 talks about, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Right? So Jesus here is giving us events, signs of his coming. Instead of us being told the date and the hour of his coming, Jesus wants to keep us on our toes, and he gives us signs that we should look out for. And these signs are very important because it doesn't matter which generation you live in, you will see different signs from that point on that are showing us that are we close to the time of the prophetic. So Jesus talks about the Great Tribulation. Like I say, the Great Tribulation is referring to the time of the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages from 538 AD to 1798. And this was a time when the papacy came into power, and there was great persecution. And like what Jesus said, this was a time like no other in the world. And it was so bad that this time cannot be compared to any other. And the days or the days that the saints would face persecution would be shortened for the elect's sake. And these are events that we will see being repeated again in the future. Jesus goes on to show us signs. Remember what we're doing. We're trying to understand, keep the goal in mind. We want to understand if we are living in the time of the loud cry, but we want to also understand the connection of that with the loud cry message. We want to understand, according to the signs that we have been given, we want to look at the prophetic clock to see where are we. As far as Revelation chapter 14 is concerned, has the first angel's message already happened? Has the second already happened? Are we actually now in the third? So we're going back into history for those that have just joined us. So we want to see now, Jesus gives us signs. We need to go back to these signs. Let me give you an example. If you are going to work and you're preparing, tomorrow you're going to work, or maybe it's whatever day of the week it is, you are preparing to go to work the next morning, you are going to make sure that all preparations are in place so that you can be up early in the morning. Some of us will even use an alarm on our phones or devices or whatever, just to make sure that we wake up on time. So when you know that you are either expecting someone or you're going to work, you put preparations in place. You make sure your car is fueled, or you've got the bus fare or taxi money. You make sure you wake up on time. And when you wake up in the morning and it's 5 a.m. and you are supposed to be up by 6, you know, oh, actually I've got 1 hour before I'm supposed to wake up. Okay, let me go back to sleep. Or I'm supposed to leave the house at 7. When you look at the clock, it tells you whether it's time for you to start preparing, whether that time that you're supposed to leave the house is near. If you decide to ignore the time, you are going to be late. And if you depend on your instincts, for instance, just to think, well, I'll figure out at some point, I'll you know, when I feel okay, I'll go. When you know you're supposed to start work at 8 o'clock, you are going to be late, and there'll be consequences to that. So if you are clever, you will make sure that you keep an eye on the clock, you prepare, you time your journey. It will take me half an hour to get to drive to work, so I need to make sure that I leave the house at this time. So that is another way of putting in keeping yourself alert and awake, making sure you wake up on time, and so forth and so forth. So if you are expecting in the same vein, if we as God's people are expecting the coming of Christ, Jesus has given us signs to show us exactly where we are on the prophetic clock. And these are some of the signs. We cannot ignore them, except at our own peril. So these are some of the signs that show us that we are now living in the end times. So some of these signs, Jesus was about the great tribulation, and he was talking about for the elect's sake, they are going to be within the intensity of that time and how hard that time was going to be for his people. But he also tells us on verse 29 that immediately after the tribulation of those days, something was going to happen. He tells us that the sun was going to be darkened. The moon would not give a light. We want to pinpoint, remember, when the first angel's message was given. We want to also say, the sun is going to be darkened. The moon shall not give her light. The stars shall fall. The stars shall fall, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. So let's try.
Please speak into the microphone, I think.
Oh, can you hear me now? Is that any better?
Yeah, you've been coming in and out. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so we want to try. Jesus is giving us in verse 29 the signs of the towards the end of 1,260 years. Time of trouble, the dark ages, rather, 1,260 years during the time when the papacy was in power. The dark ages, really, when all the persecution was happening and the light of God from the people and the tyranny was happening. Christ is talking about towards the end of that tribulation, just after the tribulation of those days. There were certain signs that Jesus gave that we want to look into just a little bit. He says the sun shall be darkened. He says the moon would not give her light. He says the stars would and the powers of heaven were going to be shaken. So let's look into these signs just a little bit more. He says that the stars. So in response, Jesus was, like I said before, Jesus was giving a response to the question the disciples had answered, they had asked. So if we look into the Bible, you will see that about 8 writers, there are about 8 writers in the Bible. Remember these signs that we were given. There are 8 writers in the Bible that were talking about the sun, the moon, and the stars as heralds of the last days. So Christ is not the first one in the New Testament to highlight these issues. They were given for a reason. So we want to look into it a little bit more. So if we look at some of those Bible writers who talked about the signs in the sky, in the heavenly bodies that were going to be given as signs of the last days. These writers are Joel, Amos, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. They talked about these signs of the last. So in total, if you count them, there'll be about 8 of them. deception of the description of the signs in the heavenly bodies given by these 8 writers points out at least 13 peculiarities, which unmistakably indicate the time and nature of their occurrence. The time when men might look for signs in the heaven is given by Matthew. What does Matthew say? He says immediately after the tribulation of those days, we would see the sun darkened, we would see the moon not giving her light, right? So the tribulation, so the reason why Jesus gave those signs is so that we can be alert and awake to realize that something unique would happen at that particular time. So from 538 to 1798, but these signs were not going to happen after 1798. They were going to happen just before the end of the 1,260 years. So the tribulation of those days is the period, like I said before, I explained this to you, that period is actually the period that is referred to as the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel. So this is the time that began in 538 to 1798, right? But
when the papacy was in charge of civil affairs and ecclesiastical affairs of the known world.
Yes. And like we said, this was a time when the papacy was persecuting God's people and anyone that would be seeking for light and truth from the word of God. But in Matthew, remember we read that verse that said that time would be shortened for God's people, for the elect's sake. So if it wasn't shortened, none would survive. But for the sake of the elect, it would be shortened. So the dark ages were also shortened. So the persecution did not last the whole entire 1,260 years. But God in his mercy, he shortened them. So immediately after
let me just add one layer to that, which is basically when you look at it, Sister White actually says the noonday of the papacy was the night of the world, of the whole world. And that is aptly known as the Dark Ages. But I want you to see what's happening here. So that means there was a sunrise of the papacy, and we see that stretching all the way back before the beginning of this prophecy. And Paul in 2 Thessalonians is talking about the one who letteth has to be taken out of the way, which was the imperial powers of Rome. And we already see, and I'm going back a little bit, Emperor Constantine by 312 AD, coming from England to position himself as the emperor after his father's death. He gave way to Rome. So this is the working out of the mystery of iniquity. He gave way to, in other words, he created a new headquarters for the empire in Constantinople in Turkey. And that left that vacant that Paul was talking about. Remember, it is Paul who's talked about, and if you read the Great Controversy, talking about this very same chapter, about the proclamation of the first angel. That's the background that she is giving. But it took Emperor Constantine removing the throne of the empire to Constantinople to create that vacuum where the egg, the spurious egg of the papacy would be brooded and hatched. And 10 years of him going into work, as an emperor, declaring himself a Christian, it took just 10 years from 312 AD. Do I still remember the date? To declare the first Sunday law. So while he had pretended to be a Christian, he came up as a true child of the of paganism. Again, taking the Babylonian title, he was, and all his predecessors, Pontifex Maximus, which is now what the papacy referred to them, the bridge builders. But that was the building up But I want you to see that is the sunrise of the papacy. And by 538 AD, Emperor Justinian gives up his throne and power. He gave the power to the beast. And that's why we aptly decode the dragon first as the devil, according to Revelation 12, but also as Rome. Dragon power is also Rome, because they were working in synergy, just like Herod in Revelation 12 wanted to kill Christ, and also the devil wanted to kill Christ for different reasons, but they were united in purpose and action. So basically, the sunrise reaches 538 AD. But I want you to notice that, again, the papacy was not a persecuting power by that time, not much of a persecuting power. And they grew their civic powers, so much so that by 1000, the darkness was palpable, you could touch it. And they bore absolute sway. And then the sun began to rise. That's why we are told of John Wycliffe, 1300s, and he becomes the morning star of the Reformation. And as soon as truth is elevated, and as soon as the righteousness of Christ was preached in that time, it spelled the end of the papacy, in other words. So by the time Luther and all the reformers, Jerome Huss and Melanchthon, and even to the time of Tudor England, when people like, what's his name, John the Wesley brothers, yes, John Wesley, but also William Tyndale, and the coming in of Bible societies, the righteousness of Christ is preached, so much so that it took away, it arrested, as it were, the power of Rome. So to my studies, you can go and look for yourself. My studies so far, it was not Napoleon or General Berthier who inflicted the wound. The wound had already been inflicted by the preaching of truth and the righteousness of Christ. So the mortal wound of Rome is first inflicted by the preaching of truth, and then that culminated into 1798, when Rome loses her power. But at the middle of that period, the 1260 years, that's where it was the darkest, right at the middle. So it's a crescendo, it's a night, as it were. If it is a graph, it will ascend and then descend. So Rome rises to power, Rome falls. But right in the middle of that period is where most of its power and persecuting power is exerted. But it is the gospel, again, that curtailed the work of evil. And hence, yes, where you are, Tendai, you can come in, where you are in with the fulfillment of Matthew 24 and all these other Bible writers and prophets who are predicting the signs and the harbingers of what's to come. And as Matthew is saying, at the end of that tribulation, that's when you see the signs, according to Matthew, the words of Christ.
Yes, so these signs that Jesus gave, any questions, any contributions? Okay, these signs that Jesus gave are very significant as to the beginning of the first angel's message, and that's what we're looking into. If we look at Mark, the way that he describes the same events described in the book of Matthew 24, he says, in those days after that tribulation, the way he words it, in those days after that tribulation, then he goes on to illustrate it. That is the period of the 1260 years before 1798, after 1776, the sun shall be darkened, the moon shall not give a light, and so forth. But let's go into I just had to put this little picture. Forgive me, it might not be so clear, but this book, for those that have this book, Gems from the Book of Revelation by Patrick Jones, it's very interesting because a part of it covers these verses. You remember we said 8 Bible writers give the signs that Jesus gave, right? In total, about 8, about the darkening of the sun, the moon not giving her light, and so forth. Those verses are illustrated here immediately after the tribulation under this topic that says the sun became as dark as sackcloth. So we have Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. Matthew chapter 24, verse 29. That's the one that we were reading. And then in the book of Mark, you find the same illustration in the book of Mark chapter 13, 24. Mark is also talking about the tribulation of those days. The book of Joel also talks about the signs that Jesus gave. Joel chapter 2, verse 31. And we also find that in the book, Joel says the sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and terrible day of the Lord. Isaiah says this, a similar thing. He talks, actually Amos 5 verse 8, maketh the day dark with night. Amos as well. Isaiah, the sun shall be darkened in his going forth. That's Isaiah 13:10. And Amos 8:9 as well. I will cause the sun to go down at noon, and I will darken the earth in clear day. These are events that actually transpired. Ezekiel talks about it. 32 verse 7. I will cover the earth with a cloud. This Revelation chapter 6 as well talks about it. Revelation chapter 6:12. So these are just a few samples of verses to read. The book in itself is quite good for those that would want to have it. It covers the whole book of Revelation. It's a study. It's a study book. It's very interesting. If you would like a copy, get in touch. Let's look at this timeline of events now. So we know, like we already illustrated, the Dark Ages started from 538 AD to 1798. In 1 November 1755, we had the Lisbon earthquake, which is the greatest earthquake that has ever taken place on Earth. And all the others have only just been babies compared to that. And Jesus in Matthew chapter...
The Lisbon earthquake, according to some sources, was a magnitude 10. And some sources will say the worst ones none before the Lisbon earthquake and none after were that much. And it actually caused, if I'm not mistaken, it was the first time when the Richter scale was established. It was life-changing, so to speak, the experience. And for those who haven't read it in the book, The Great Controversy, it paints a very good picture of what was achieved and what God achieved by allowing that to happen.
Okay, yes. So the Lisbon earthquake, the reason why I decided to put it in here is because it was very significant as to how the events that transpired after it. Remember, we're still trying to pinpoint the time when the first angel's message started and to see where we are living, if we are living in the time of the loud cry. Now, follow still. The Lisbon earthquake happened in 1 November 1755. And when it happened, all the areas that were badly affected by this earthquake, historically, if you go back and do the history, you will see that these were areas that were actually, here's a historical fact. I actually put it here as well from the same book that I told you. A historical fact, the Lisbon earthquake helped to stop the persecution of heretics. And the last martyr for conscience sake was 1776. Some would say 1773, but between 1773 and 1776, we see actually there was a decree that was given that persecution should stop at that time. And 1776, we see the last martyr to be publicly executed for conscience sake. So the Lisbon earthquake, it helped to stop the persecution of heretics. And what's interesting about it is the Lisbon earthquake for many years Lisbon, the area Lisbon, was actually for many years a slave trade capital of the world. So there was a lot of paganism that was taking place, not just that, but a lot of slavery. So we can see Rome at work here. We can see the papacy at work here as well. So we see that God used this Lisbon earthquake to actually bring a stop to persecution. My time is running out, but let me go back to the timeline of events. So after 1755, we have the Dark Day in May 19, 1780. So we see that Jesus, do you remember Matthew chapter 24 that we read? Jesus talks about the darkening of the sun, the moon not giving her light. So we see that that day was actually fulfilled. That sign was seen just after 1776. This is May 19, 1780, just before the end of the 1260 years. And after that, the next significant event after the 1260 years complete, the next event after that was the falling of the stars. Again, according to the Bible writers, according to the verses that we saw here, we saw the Bible had already predicted from the Old Testament to the New Testament that these signs were to happen. But why was the Bible, why is God highlighting all of these events? They are significant. Why? Because they help us to understand that when these signs happen after the tribulation of those days, something God was about to raise up a big movement that would start to preach a message that could not have been preached any other time before that, right? So we see, this is just reiterating the same point, right? This is just reiterating the same points that we did. I haven't got much time, but let's go to the book of Daniel chapter 12. We're not going to read the whole of Daniel chapter 12, but let's go to verse 8. Let's start from verse 8. Daniel chapter 12, if you got your Bibles. Daniel chapter 12, verse 8. Daniel chapter 12, verse 8. It says, and I heard, but I understood. So what did Daniel hear? Daniel, let me start from verse 7. And I heard the man clothed in linen, which was upon the waters of the river, when he held up his hand and his right hand, and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and half a time. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished. And verse 8, and I heard, but I understood not. Then said I, oh my Lord, what shall be the end of these things? Verse 9, and he said, go thy way, Daniel, for the words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. Many, verse 10, shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand, but the wise shall understand. So here we see in the book of Daniel, Daniel is shown also the persecuting power of Rome and its work. Of course, Daniel did not quite fully understand how these things would end, and that was his question, how and when the time of the end would be. And he was told to go his way. But he was shown that this persecuting power would do the most to persecute and suppress the truth for 1,260 years that are being referred here. It's a deep subject on itself. We just want to pass through it. But Daniel says, I heard, but I didn't understand. And this starts all the way back from chapter 7 of Daniel, chapter 8, where God describes in detail what this persecuting power of the little one will do in suppressing the word of God, in even taking away the daily. A lot of us know this subject, but I just want to highlight the point where Daniel did not quite understand, and he was asking what shall be the end of these things. But he is told something interesting that we need to connect with the signs that we have just read. He is told to seal up. The words are closed up and sealed till the time of the end. So let me preempt this point. When it says the words are sealed up, it doesn't mean that the whole book of Daniel is sealed up. It simply means the portion, because when you read from chapter 10, is it from chapter 10 onwards to chapter 12? This is one vision that Daniel was given. This is one vision all the way. And it was this portion that was relating. So we see that during this time, God had revealed to Daniel that unto 2,360 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. And the angel Gabriel had explained in detail the 70 weeks and what would happen, at least the ministry of Christ, and those that read and understood knew when the 70 weeks would start, right? From 457 BC. And they knew when the Messiah was anointed, his death, his ministry, his crucifixion. But then just before 1798, a lot of the people then, we have no evidence to show that they had any connection, or they could not fully, God did not reveal the light that was sealed up for them is the connection between the 70 weeks and the 2,300 days. They did not quite know when the 2,300 days would end. But God said to Daniel, go thy way. The words are sealed up. At a certain time, God would show his people the connection. Why did God close up that message? Because it would not be it was not yet time. It is a message that would be connected to a judgment. It is a message that would be connected to the judgment message, to the beginning of the investigation.
Sister White puts it this way in, I think, Great Controversy chapter 20, that message would not be preached, and it would not be correct if it were preached any other time, because the first angel's message is fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come. So unless the judgment is come, that message was irrelevant. And hence, this is the portion of the book of Daniel that was sealed until the time of the end, which is basically end of the tribulation, 1798. So this message would open up only after the fall of the first reign of the papacy.
Okay, so you is told to go your way, Daniel, and the words are closed up and sealed up until the time of the end. So we need to identify what the time of the end is. Many shall be purified at that time and made white. Made white, that implies judgment. But the wicked shall do wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. So let's go into, Talent, you mentioned The Great Controversy by Ellen G. White. Chapter 20 of The Great Controversy she's addressing this very same subject. And I'm not going to be able to read everything because of our time, but I'm just going to highlight some of the things. A great religious awakening. So the point is 1798 is the time of the end, according to the Bible. Why is it the time of the end? These signs were given so that they could highlight, or they could point or remind or show people that this is the beginning of the time when God would have his judgment, our message preached, and it would make sense. Why? This is where also Paul was talking to the Paul was talking to the Colossians. I don't know if I've got this here. No, I haven't got it here. Oh yeah, Paul was talking to the Thessalonians, I think to the Thessalonians, and he was saying to the Thessalonians that they should not expect the coming of Christ on that end of time, but the coming of Christ would not happen until after the great apostasy, that long period of the reign of the men of sin. That is the 1,260 years. After that time, then God would start to raise up a movement of people that would study. If we go back to the book of Daniel, it says, many shall be purified and made white and tried, but the wicked shall continue to do wickedly. There's another verse where it says, many shall run to and fro. It's also that scripture, many shall run to and fro, I think it's verse 4, but thou, O Daniel, shut up the words, seal up the book, even to the time of the end. many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall be increased. This verse has other other meanings and fulfillments, but it also, the fulfillment of it was also at the time of the end. The time of the end is 1798. And it refers to the time when God revealed the judgment, our message, the connection between the 70 weeks of Daniel and the 2,300 days, and the time in which those those 2,300 days would terminate. That knowledge, the knowledge of the termination of those days, was revealed. The coming or the starting of the judgment, our message. This message was revealed at the end, when after they had seen these signs. So God gave these signs that we were reading about so that they would help people to understand the time that they were living in. Not only that, if we go deeper into history, we will see that everywhere, well, actually, according to John Loughborough, one of the Adventist pioneers, he's got a book, the great, what is it called?
The rise and progress of the rise and progress of the Great Advent movement.
Yes. He talks about everywhere where these signs were seen, the gospel was preached. What gospel was it? The gospel that God had revealed, that the termination of the 2,300 days, the same message that we see in Revelation chapter 14, verse 6 and 7, which is fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come. Part of what is interesting that I read, not only in historical books, but also in our Adventist history, is that the people during that time, even during the time of the Dark Ages, calamities of a particular nature were believed to be judgments from God. So certain strange phenomena or even signs in the heavens or signs in the sky, they believed that it pointed to some kind of judgment from God. It meant that the judgment of God was upon the people. And even the Black Death, they saw the Black Death as punishment from God. So when we see that when God gave these signs, the signs followed the believers. Everywhere where the people were preaching those, and it was not just, we're going to see later on that it was not just William Miller in America. Yes, America was the center. It was where this message was mostly preached with its full impact. It had its major fulfillment and impact. But this was a global movement. And a lot of us have not quite known that or comprehended that. This preaching of the message of the third angel, it was not just a William Miller and the others who were preaching with them in America. It was global, and there is evidence to prove that. It's so we see that.
Yeah, I think
I'm going to get into that in a minute. Okay. So God raised up these people so that this message could be preached in different parts of the world. So let's read Great Controversy. Ellen White says, chapter 20 of Great Controversy, a great religious awakening under the proclamation of Christ's soon coming is foretold in prophecy of the first angel's message of Revelation 14. An angel is seen flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach unto them that dwell on the earth, to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, right? Saying with a loud voice, we already know this. Let me skip to the next slide. The message in itself that we have read in Revelation 14, verse 6 and 7, the first angel's message, it's shedding light as to when it was actually to be proclaimed. It says the everlasting gospel. It's announcing the opening of a judgment. It's announcing the opening of the judgment. And if we look at the opening of the judgment, this message would have to be proclaimed before the opening of the investigative judgment. The investigative judgment was opened when? 1844, October 22. The message of salvation has been preached in all ages, but this message is part of the gospel which could be proclaimed only in the last days. For only then would it be true that the hour of judgment had come. So the prophecies present a succession of events leading down to the opening of the judgment. This is especially true in the book of Daniel, like we've just read, but that part of this prophecy which related to the last days Daniel was bidden to close. So it's not the whole book of Daniel. Some people you hear that will tell you, well, the book of Daniel was closed and sealed up. We're not meant to understand it. That's not true. It was unsealed. That particular portion was sealed until the time of the end. So God did not bring that light to the people until it was relevant for them to understand it. And now it is relevant for us to understand because it applies to our time. Not till we reach this could a message concerning the judgment be proclaimed. So this is why Jesus was giving us those signs, so that the people would believe, so that the people would start to understand and to see the significance of the time that they are living in. Those signs were pointing to the judgment, our message. So many would run to and fro, and even the wicked would do wickedly, but the wise would understand. So no such a message, like we said before, would be preached any other time. And Paul talks about it, and even Martin Luther as well. He talks about the judgment message being about 300 years into the future, right? The reformers also proclaimed it. The judgment hour would not happen until not in the time of the Dark Ages. So we have seen that the Lisbon earthquake, these harbingers, these signs were great for those that read and understood the prophecies. They would know that something big is about to happen, and that's what God wanted to point our attention to.
But so, also these judgments, these harbingers of the end time, from the Black Death, but especially the falling of the stars, back to the Dark Day and back to the Lisbon earthquake, there were also judgments of Rome. God judged Rome. If you read Revelation chapter 2, I think, the church of Thyatira, if I'm not mistaken, God's saying, I will put her, Jezebel, in a bed. And the papacy, so to speak, was put in a bed, especially in 1798, where the papacy received a mortal wound that seemed to not be healable. But John says that it was a marvel. The wound was healed. So these were not just harbingers of the second coming, but they were also punishments for the sins of Rome during the Dark Ages. Hence, when you read chapter 17 of the Great Controversy, you will see that the earthquake particularly hit the most prominent Catholic and sinful places, like you had said. Lisbon, for example, was a center for slavery, and this was hit the most. And Sister White is describing how it was on a high day. I think it was All Saints, if I'm not mistaken, and everyone in the realm of Rome was actually in the churches. And when the earthquake started, they ran into the cathedrals and churches for safety, but these were hit first, and all of them were destroyed. So God was using it as a warning of the judgments, but it was also a judgment to Rome, a temporal judgment.
Yes. So just my time is up now, but like the Great Reformation of the 16th century, the Advent movement. So when God revealed this light to different people in different parts of the world, the Advent movement appeared in different countries of Christendom at the same time. So in both Europe and America, men of faith were led to study the prophecies, tracing down their record. They saw convincing evidence that the end of all things was at hand. In different parts of the land, there were isolated body of Christians who solely by study of the scriptures arrived at the belief that the Savior's advent was near. So the conclusion that the believers came to in the Advent movement in America was not just there, it was in different parts of the world. Men of faith who were convinced through studying that this was the time this message was to be fulfilled. They believed that the 2,300 days would terminate in the coming of Christ. They all came to the same conclusion round about the same time and started preaching that message. So to William Miller and his co-laborers, it was given to preach the warning. So we see that 1798 is marking that particular time. Those signs were pointing to that particular time. It was given to William Miller and his co-laborers so that they would preach this message. And like I said, America was just a center of it. I'm not going to be able to read some of these quotations, but what was the result of their preaching? Their preaching resulted in many people accepting. They heard the message. This convicting spirit of God spoke to their hearts, and many people were led to search the scriptures with new and deeper interest, with intemperate and the intemperate and immoral were reformed. Others abandoned their dishonest practices, and a work was done so marked that even ministers of the state church were forced to acknowledge that the hand of God was in the movement. So we see how God fulfilled how the first Advent message was actually how the first angel's message was preached. Not to say that this message can no longer be preached, because this message stretches all the way to the end of time, of our time, all the way to the close of probation. We can still preach this message because it is still relevant to our time, because the judgment hour is come. So the Lord, he appointed the parable.
It is part of the everlasting gospel.
Yes, it is part of the everlasting gospel. And God gave the parable. If you go back to Matthew chapter 24, he gave the parable of the fig tree. And the parable of the fig tree, when you see the leaves, how do we know that it's summer? How do we know that summer is nigh? How do we know that the summer is nigh? What are some of the signs that we can tell us that, yeah, this means that summer is nigh, spring? Anyone? No, we all don't know how some of the
blossoms and leaves start appearing on the tree. In fact, blossoms first.
Yeah. We start to see some tender plants, some flowers coming out, and God used the parable of the fig tree for God's people to start to understand that this was a sign. This was a sign to show that the time of the end is here, and we should understand what that time was signifying. So here, the Lord's time for the world to be aroused to the great truth that His coming is at the door. That's what all those signs were meaning, and that His coming would be before the generation who would hear, who would see all these things come to pass. In other words, so we see that these prophecies, these events just before 1844, there were different events that were marking the end of time. Another thing that I was going to touch on a little bit later is that if we go back into the sanctuary message, we're going to realize that the sanctuary message, for those who have studied it, we know about the blowing of the trumpets. The blowing of the trumpets happened. When did the blowing of the trumpets happen? When did we see that feast taking place? Does anyone know?
Yes, the antitype of it was, so everything that Jesus lined up in Matthew 24 and Luke 21 lines up clearly with the sanctuary message, and how we are, proves that we are actually living in the last days, and end of days are marked by the end of the first reign of the papacy. But William Miller, just one of the examples of the men who were preaching it, received his preaching license after the falling of the stars, or during the year when the falling of the stars happened, which was a sign of the end. And he got his preaching license, and he preached for exactly 10 years. His message spanned a period of 10 years. And in the sanctuary, the judgment, the Day of Atonement, would happen 10 days before, the day of 10 days after the blowing of the trumpets. So they would blow trumpets for 10 days before the Day of Atonement yearly. And this is when type met antitype, because William Miller and many others, Joseph Wolff, Lacunza, the Spaniard, because what the Jesuits and Rome have done is to minimalize the message by insinuating that the Great Disappointment was a sign that this was a wrong message. But by the same token, they would have to say Jesus was never born, because this prophecy in Daniel 8 stretches all the way the repatriation of the Israelites, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the coming of Christ, his dying in the middle of the week, until it terminated in 1844. So they would have to dismiss all the other things. So, and why 1844? Initially, they thought 1843, but they had miscalculated which season it was based on the Jewish calendar. But basically, it
wasn't
fulfilled.
Wasn't it the year zero problem that made them miscalculate?
It was also the year zero problem, but also the season. The calculation also on the season was wrong. But they had not factored that there is no year zero, so that adjusted the time properly. Yeah, but basically, it was a perfect fulfillment of the prophecy. And as such, we can gather faith. This is where even Daniel is saying the wise shall understand. We need to be wise, despite what people may say about the disappointment, which is not the first time God's people have been disappointed. But yeah, basically, it was a definitive.
The antitypical Day of Atonement began on the 22nd of October, 1844.
1844, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, you are right. The adjustment of the year zero, yes, the year zero problem, as well as understanding. Also, I think it was Charles Fitch. His understanding on what the season was, basically.
Yeah. The only thing is they made a mistake thinking it was the cleansing of the sanctuary was going to be the earth.
Yeah.
Yes.
They didn't. It was only till Hiram Edson and Crozier were walking in the cornfields that Hiram Edson had the vision.
Yes.
Yes.
So my time is way past. So I just want to conclude on this point and maybe finish on the next lesson that we come back to this. In fulfillment of this prediction, remember the parable of the fig trees, when its leaves are yet tender, we start to see when the first signs of summer or spring are coming. This was supposed to help us understand that when we start to see these signs, the end is here. We are now living in the end time, and these signs were pointing to the time of the end and the judgment hour to be preached. In fulfillment of this prediction, we find that God was raising up people. So the Lord was raising up messengers, ministers in various parts of the world, who from 1833 to 1834, they were also sounding the message of the coming of Christ, that Christ was even at the door. They were teaching the parable of the fig tree. They were pointing to these signs that we were reading. Even through literature, they were using literature. They were using the printed page. They were preaching. They were using the printed page to reach every part of the globe. So there's evidence. I'll give you a little bit of the evidence here to show that it was a worldwide movement as well. The everlasting gospel. So actually, the extent of the message has been plainly set forth by the editor of the Voice of Truth. Right? Voice of Truth, this is an Adventist publication, and it says in there, the everlasting gospel, as described in Revelation 14, verse 6 to 7, has been preached. So the point that I would conclude on is that this message, God raised up messengers, right, who were preaching this message, and this message was preached globally to every creature upon the earth. The everlasting gospel, as described in Revelation 14, 6 and 7, has been preached to every nation, kindred, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come. Worship him that made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. So no case can be more clearly substantiated with facts than that this message has been born to every nation and tongue under the heaven, even with very few, within a very few within a very few years, right? In preaching of the coming of Christ in 1843 Jewish time, 1844, or near at hand, through the medium of literature, right? Lectures, publications. So we see that this message had gone to all the earth, and the words were heard everywhere. So Can you actually see? So we see that I want to show you that the message of Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, and this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached unto all nations. There are 3 times in which we will see a fulfillment of this nature of the gospel being preached globally to every creature on earth. One is during the time of Paul, right? In Colossians 1:23, Paul states that the gospel had been preached and been heard by every creature which is under heaven. So we see that that was also a fulfillment of the word, the message, the gospel being preached. And also this time before 1844, announcing the judgment, our message, the message was also preached to every creature. And there are more quotations I can show you in our Adventist literature and books and through Ellen White, Spirit of Prophecy and the Bible. But because of time, I'm not able to do that. But by 1844, again, we see that fulfillment. The gospel was preached to every creature. But there's one more time that this message has to be fulfilled again, Matthew 24, which is our time. By the time the mark of the beast Christ comes, by the time probation closes, Matthew chapter 24 has to see another fulfillment again. The whole entire nation, the whole entire every creature, everyone on earth would have heard the message very, very well. And Ellen White states it. She says the Sunday law will not be edged upon the people blindly. So in other words, the work of the third angel is to make sure that people know and understand what is coming, which is why we are constantly out there looking, not just studying and understanding what time we are living in, but also showing the people the time that we are living in and what is coming. Because she says every person who's going to receive the mark of the beast or who's going to refuse, none of this will be edged upon the people blindly, which means they would have known, God would have brought this light in one way or another, that everybody who's going to receive the mark of the beast will do so, will make an informed decision. Or those who will reject it, it will be an informed decision. Hence, by the time probation closes, before the plague starts, every nation, every creature, every person would have heard the message and made a decision for or against Christ. So there's a lot to this message, but I will stop here because I've gone past the time that we were hoping. But I hope that this can be a blessing to us to understand that we are now living in the time of the end. 1798 marked the time when this message was to be going to all nations. So next time we will probably go into showing how the second angel's message was fulfilled. And then after that, we can show how the third angel's message, when did it begin? Its connection to the sealing message, its connection to the third angel's message, and most importantly,
the fourth angel's message.
And the fourth angel's message, its connection to the righteousness by faith message. We want to understand the significance. All of this is building up to the 1888 conference. Remember, we touched this slightly last time, but we want to touch the importance of that particular conference and what God really intended, what we were supposed to learn and what we were supposed to see, the significance of what happened right there, what that 1888 conference marked, and to understand, are we really living in the loud cry time? Is the mark of the beast crisis here? What evidence do we have to prove that? What is the connection between that and the righteousness by faith message? And then we can go deeper into the message that God intended us to understand. Thank you very much. Are there any questions before I give end the lesson and hand over to Talent? Any questions, contributions?
Just one from me.
Sorry, go on.
Go on, brother Ian.
Okay. I like the emphasis on spreading the message around the world through publications and the 1844 Great Disappointment, which must have caused ripples around the world. It just made me think that the last great test will do something similar, won't it?
Absolutely.
Yes. So this message of the end time is going to be a global message, and also God is still using similar methods and even newer methods. So the literature is a sure way that this message is going to reach the people. Because look at the time we're living in, you know, where anything that is digital is something that can be controlled, and it's something that can be deleted. It's something that they can just lock you out of any digital device. So it is important for us to actually use books, literature, leaflets. A book that is in your house is not going to be easily controlled unless if someone physically takes it away from you. And we can go back to the traditional way. So God is raising up a movement that is going to fulfill again, just as he has done before. The message is going to come to its full fruition, its fulfillment. There was someone else who wanted to speak. Was it?
I just wanted to say that the exact fulfillment of the first angel's message, which is what we've touched today, was from 1833, Miller receiving his preaching license to the opening of the judgment, 1844, which basically a 10-year period of warning people about the judgment, and reiterate that he was not a lone ranger. And these people, just like Luther and Zwingli, they did not collude. In fact, to some extent, Miller is given prominence because it's an American setting, but Joseph Wolff, that German Jew American, did a much more wider work than Miller, and his conclusions were very similar to those of Miller, and they did not have every calculation perfect, but what actuated them was the same spirit, and it was the same message. It was Christ is coming back around the same time, 1844. And in fact, what was more with Joseph Wolff is he went all over Africa and all over Asia, and as far as India, preaching this, and then preached it again in America and preached in Congress.
Dr. Wolff traveled in the most barbarous countries without the protection of any European authority, enduring many hardships and surrounded with countless perils. He was bastinadoed and starved, sold as a slave, and 3 times condemned to death. He was beset by robbers and sometimes nearly perished from thirst. Once he was stripped of all that he possessed and left to travel hundreds of miles on foot through the mountains, the snow beating in his face and his naked feet benumbed by contact with the frozen ground. Thus he persevered in his labors until the message of the judgment had been carried to a large part of the habitable globe. Among Jews, Turks, Parsis, Hindus, and many other nationalities and races, he distributed the word of God in these various tongues, and everywhere heralded the approaching reign of the Messiah.
Then you got Lacunza in South America, whose writings were translated. And it was not Miller who brought the message of the second coming to England. It was actually Lacunza's Spanish writings that were translated into English. And there were many other English people who were preaching the same message at the very same time. And hence,
yes, and Lacunza was an ex-Catholic priest.
He was also a Jesuit.
So, because God brought all of the Christians together, including a Catholic priest.
He was not just a priest; he was actually a Jesuit priest.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, he was.
Oh, okay. All right. Now,
and the reason why he used Lacunza, he used a pseudonym to publish it because of his Jesuit roots. So he published his work under the name of Rabbi Ben Ezra. But his
Rabbi
name
Ben
was
Ezra.
Yeah.
Rabbi
Ben Ezra.
Ezra, very interesting.
It's there in the Great Controversy.
It's in the Great Controversy, chapter 20. But basically, the strict fulfillment is that 10-year period. But as this is part of the everlasting gospel, it was one angel of the 3 angels in Revelation 14, one angel putting his message forth and being joined by another angel, not that the angel terminated. So the message about fearing God and giving glory did not terminate in 1844. it stretches all the way until Michael stands up. So as long as Jesus is still on the right hand of the Father in the most holy place, the message, fear God and give him glory, for the hour of his judgment is come, is still relevant. I'm hoping that the lesson was clear enough to build a solid foundation. Like I said at the beginning of it, the aim is to demonstrate that, whether or not we are actually in the loud cry of the third angel, and what are the dynamics involved in it, as far as scripture is concerned, and with the historical evidence. I'm hoping that we'll be able to continue this lesson next week and establish a firm foundation for the message, so that when we delve into it, we will know that we are on the correct platform of truth.